Every theory in psychology begins with a problem that existing frameworks cannot solve. Attachment theory began with one that seemed deceptively simple. Why do infants scream when separated from their mothers? In the middle of the 20th century, the dominant answer was that infants associate their mothers with food. The mother feeds the child learns to prefer the mother, and what looks like love is really learned appetite. That answer turned out to be catastrophically wrong, and the process of discovering why it was wrong forced a complete rethinking of human emotional development. What emerged from that rethinking is attachment theory, now the most influential framework in developmental psychology. It makes specific, testable claims about how the earliest relationships shape the mind. It proposes that infants are born with a biological system designed not to seek food, but to seek proximity to a protective caregiver. It argues that this system generates mental representations that persist across the entire lifespan. And it claims that these representations are transmitted, often invisibly, from one generation to the next. This episode will reconstruct attachment theory from its foundations to its unresolved frontiers. We will build every concept from the ground up, starting with the problem each concept was designed to solve. The goal is not to survey the theory, but to think through it, claim by claim, evidence by evidence. By the end, you will understand not only what attachment theory says, but where it remains genuinely uncertain. That begins with a question about baby monkeys and a piece of cloth. Part 1. The Cupboard and the Cloth. For most of the 20th century, two rival schools of psychology agreed on almost nothing. Psychoanalysis, founded by Sigmund Freud, explained human behavior through unconscious drives and internal fantasies. Behaviorism, championed by figures like B.F. Skinner, rejected all talk of the unconscious and studied only observable behavior. These two traditions disagreed about nearly every question in psychology. But on one question, they converged on the same answer. That question was why an infant bonds with its mother. Freud's explanation was that the infant is born with oral drives, with instinctual needs centered on the mouth. The mother satisfies those drives through feeding, and the infant redirects its libidinal energy toward her. She becomes what Freud called a love object, because she is the first source of drive satisfaction. The behaviorist explanation ran differently, but arrived at the same destination. Through repeated pairing of the mother with the reduction of hunger, the infant learns to associate her with comfort. She becomes a conditioned stimulus, a signal that relief is coming. In both frameworks, the bond is a byproduct of being fed. This was called the cupboard love theory, and for decades it went largely unchallenged. It had an elegant simplicity that made it hard to argue against on purely logical grounds. After all, newborn infants do need food, mothers do provide it, and infants do seem calmer after eating. If you had to bet on what drives the infant toward the mother, food is the obvious candidate. The problem came from a laboratory at the University of Wisconsin in the late 1950s. Harry Harlow was studying learning in rhesus monkeys and had been raising infant monkeys separately from their mothers. His staff noticed something that did not fit the cupboard theory at all. The infant monkeys became intensely attached to the soft cloth pads lining the floors of their cages. When those pads were removed for cleaning, the infants became deeply distressed. They clung to the cloth, screamed when it was taken, and behaved as though they had lost something essential. The cloth provided no food whatsoever, yet the infants treated it like a mother. Harlow designed an experiment to test the cupboard theory directly. He built 2 artificial surrogate mothers and placed them in cages with infant monkeys separated from their real mothers. One surrogate was made of bare wire mesh with a bottle of milk attached to it. The other was covered in soft terry cloth but offered no food at all. If the cupboard theory was correct, the infants should prefer whichever surrogate provided milk. Attachment should follow feeding, and the wire mother with the bottle should win. The results were not ambiguous. Infant monkeys spent between 12 and 18 hours per day clinging to the cloth mother. They visited the wire mother only long enough to feed, roughly 1 hour per day, then returned immediately to the cloth. When Harlow placed a frightening mechanical toy in the cage, the infants did not run to the food source. They ran to the cloth mother, pressed against her, and gradually calmed down. Only after calming did they turn to look at the threatening object. Infants who had only the wire mother available did not seek her out when frightened. They curled into a ball on the floor and screamed. Harlow called what the cloth mother provided contact comfort. The infants were not seeking food, they were seeking the sensation of something soft and warm to hold on to. This was not a marginal preference. Even when the wire mother was the only source of nutrition, the cloth mother dominated every measure of attachment behavior. The infants used her as a base from which to explore new environments. Without her, they were paralyzed with fear and unable to engage with anything around them. These findings destroyed the empirical foundation of the cupboard theory. If the bond between infant and caregiver were really a byproduct of feeding, the wire mother should have won. She did not come close. Something other than food was driving the attachment system, something more fundamental than learned association. But Harlow's work, powerful as it was, created a new problem. He had demonstrated what attachment was not based on. He had not yet explained what it was. If the bond is not about food, then what kind of system produces it, and why does it exist at all? Part 2. The Biological Argument. To understand where the answer came from, you need to know about a specific clash inside British psychoanalysis during the 1940s. John Bowlby was a young psychiatrist in London, training as a psychoanalyst under Melanie Klein. Klein was one of the most influential figures in the field, and she held a firm position on children's emotional problems. She believed those problems arose almost entirely from internal fantasy, from conflicts between aggressive and sexual drives inside the child's mind. External events, including how the parents actually behaved, were secondary to what the child's unconscious was generating on its own. This had a direct clinical consequence. Klein forbade Bowlby from speaking to the mother of a 3-year-old he was treating under her supervision. Bowlby found this untenable, and his objection was not merely philosophical. Before his analytic training, he had worked at a residential school for emotionally disturbed children. There he had observed a pattern that Klein's framework could not accommodate. The children who were most troubled, most aggressive, most unable to form relationships consistently had histories of disrupted or absent caregiving. Their problems tracked with real events in the real world, not with the dynamics of internal fantasy. A later study Bowlby conducted of 44 juvenile thieves confirmed this pattern with systematic data. The young offenders, who showed the most severe emotional blunting, what he called affectionless character, had experienced prolonged separation from their mothers in early childhood. This put Bowlby in direct opposition to the dominant psychoanalytic establishment of his time. Klein and her followers saw the child's inner world as the primary engine of development. Bowlby was arguing that the child's real relationships with real people were the primary engine. The psychoanalytic community largely rejected him for this, and he was effectively pushed to the margins of the field. But Bowlby did not simply argue against psychoanalysis. He imported an entirely different scientific framework. In the early 1950s, he encountered the work of Konrad Lorenz and other ethologists studying animal behavior in natural settings. Lorenz had demonstrated imprinting in greylag goslings, showing that newly hatched birds form an immediate bond with the first moving object they encounter. This bond is not learned through reward or punishment. It occurs automatically during a narrow window of time. The goslings do not follow their mother because she feeds them. They follow her because a biological system compels them to seek proximity to a caregiver figure during a critical period. Bowlby saw in ethology the conceptual tool he needed. He proposed that human infants possess an attachment behavioral system analogous to what Lorenz had described in birds. This system was not a byproduct of feeding drives or learned associations. It was a distinct biological system, shaped by natural selection with its own goal: maintaining proximity to a protective caregiver. From an evolutionary standpoint, the logic was straightforward. Infants who stayed close to adults survived. Infants who wandered off were eaten by predators. Over hundreds of thousands of years, the infants with the strongest proximity-seeking instincts were the ones who reproduced. The attachment system is their legacy. This was a radical repositioning of the question. Psychoanalysis had treated the infant's bond as a derivative phenomenon, something that emerged from the satisfaction of other drives. Behaviorism had treated it as a conditioned response built from feeding experiences. Bowlby was arguing that the bond is primary, that it exists in its own right as a biological system with its own evolutionary function. The infant does not love the mother because she provides food. The infant seeks the mother because proximity to her is the goal, and this goal is wired into the species. Bowlby now had a theoretical framework grounded in biology rather than drive theory or learning theory. But he faced a serious problem that would take decades and another researcher to solve. He could explain why an attachment system should exist in evolutionary terms. He could not yet show how it actually operated in living human infants, or how it varied from one infant to another. The theory needed a method of observation that could make the invisible system visible. That method would come not from London, but from a laboratory in Baltimore, and from a 20-minute procedure involving a mother, a baby, and a stranger. Part 3. The child who would not be comforted. Before the laboratory method arrived, the case for attachment theory was built on something more raw. In the years following the Second World War, hospitals across Britain operated under a standard policy regarding children. When a child was admitted for treatment, parents were permitted to visit only during restricted hours, sometimes just 1 hour per week. The reasoning seemed medically sound. Parental visits upset the children and made it harder for staff to manage the ward. Doctors and nurses observed that after parents left, children often cried uncontrollably for hours. The obvious solution, from the hospital's perspective, was to reduce the visits that caused the crying. A filmmaker and social worker named James Robertson saw something different in those wards. Robertson was working with Bowlby's research team at the Tavistock Clinic in London during the early 1950s. Bowlby sent him into hospitals and residential nurseries to observe and record what actually happened to separated children. What Robertson documented on film was devastating in its clarity. The pattern he captured unfolded in 3 distinct phases. First came protest. The child screamed, cried, shook the cot rails, and desperately searched for the absent mother. This phase could last hours or days, and the distress was intense and unmistakable. Hospital staff typically interpreted this as a behavioral problem to be managed. Then came despair. The child became quiet, withdrawn, and largely stopped responding to the environment. Staff often read this as the child settling in and adapting to the hospital routine. What was actually happening was the opposite of settling in. The child had not adjusted. The child had given up signalling for a caregiver who was not coming. The third phase was the most disturbing and the most misread. Robertson called it detachment. When the mother finally returned, the child did not greet her with relief. Instead, the child appeared indifferent, turning away, refusing to be held, seeming not to recognize or care about the person. Hospital staff and even some parents took this as evidence that the separation had caused no lasting harm. The child seemed fine. The crisis had apparently passed. Robertson argued that the opposite was true. The child had defensively shut down the attachment system entirely because maintaining it was too painful. Robertson's most famous film, made in 1952, followed a 2-year-old girl named Laura during an 8-day hospital stay for a minor operation. The footage showed Laura progressively moving through protest, despair, and detachment in real time. When the film was shown to medical audiences, the response was hostile. Physicians accused Robertson of selecting an atypical child, of staging the footage, of sensationalizing normal hospital adjustment. The film was difficult to watch precisely because it contradicted the professional consensus. Doctors had convinced themselves that quiet, compliant children were well-adjusted children. Robertson was showing them that compliance could be the visible surface of a profound emotional withdrawal. Bowlby had already reached a similar conclusion through his 1951 report for the World Health Organization on maternal deprivation. In that report, he reviewed evidence from across Europe and the United States on children raised in institutions or separated from their mothers during early childhood. The findings converged. Children who experienced prolonged separation showed elevated rates of emotional disturbance, intellectual delay, and difficulty forming relationships. Bowlby's central claim was direct. What is essential for mental health is a warm, intimate, and continuous relationship with the mother or a permanent mother substitute. This claim carried enormous practical consequences and generated enormous backlash simultaneously. On one side, it helped transform hospital visiting policies and contributed to a broad movement toward more humane care of children in institutions. On the other side, many women experienced Bowlby's emphasis on the mother as oppressive, as a scientific argument for keeping women in the home. Feminists pointed out that Bowlby's framework placed a suffocating burden of responsibility on mothers alone. Critics also noted that Bowlby often conflated two very different situations: children in institutions with no stable caregiver and children whose mothers worked outside the home. The political implications of the theory became entangled with the scientific claims in ways that persist to this day. But regardless of the political fallout, the observational evidence was accumulating. Separated children did show predictable patterns of distress, withdrawal, and detachment that no existing theory adequately explained. The cupboard theory could not explain why a well-fed child in a clean hospital would deteriorate emotionally simply because a specific person was absent. Psychoanalytic drive theory could not explain why the child's recovery depended not on resolving internal fantasy, but on the physical return of the caregiver. Bowlby's biological framework could accommodate these observations, but it still lacked the controlled evidence that would make it a testable scientific theory rather than a clinical interpretation. What was needed was a way to observe the attachment system operating in real time, under conditions precise enough to compare one child to another. Part 4. 20 Minutes in a Strange Room. Mary Ainsworth provided that method, and the path to it was not direct. Ainsworth was a Canadian psychologist who had trained under William Blatz at the University of Toronto, where she absorbed Blatz's security theory. Blatz argued that children need a secure base of dependent security before they can develop independent security. This idea would later become central to attachment theory, but Ainsworth did not initially connect it to Bowlby's work. In 1950, she joined Bowlby's research unit at the Tavistock Clinic, where she was assigned to analyse James Robertson's observational data on separated children. She was not yet convinced by the direction Bowlby's theorising was taking. The turning point came when Ainsworth moved to Uganda in 1954 and conducted her own naturalistic study of mothers and infants. She spent months observing 26 mother-infant pairs in their homes, recording in detail how mothers responded to their infants and how infants behaved. What she noticed was that infants did not merely seek proximity to their mothers in a uniform way. Some infants used their mothers as a launching point, venturing out to explore and returning periodically to check in. Others clung anxiously and explored very little. Still others seemed oddly indifferent, neither seeking the mother nor showing distress when she left. The quality of the attachment relationship varied, and it varied in ways that tracked with how sensitive and responsive the mother had been over the preceding months. Ainsworth needed a standardized way to observe these differences under controlled conditions. Naturalistic home observation was rich but impractical for large-scale comparison. She designed a laboratory procedure that would gently activate the attachment system and reveal the child's strategy for managing that activation. The procedure, developed for her Baltimore longitudinal study in the late 1960s, became known as the Strange situation. The setup was precise. A mother and her infant, between 12 and 18 months old, entered an unfamiliar room filled with toys. Over the next 20 or so minutes, a series of episodes unfolded in a fixed sequence. The mother sat while the infant explored. A stranger entered and attempted to interact with the infant. Then the mother left the room, leaving the infant with the stranger. After a few minutes, the mother returned, and the stranger left. Then the mother left again, this time leaving the infant completely alone. The stranger returned, and finally the mother came back for a second reunion. Each episode lasted approximately 3 minutes, and the entire procedure was filmed through a one-way mirror. The purpose was not to traumatize the child. The separations were brief, and the procedure was stopped if distress became severe. The purpose was to create a gradually escalating series of mild stresses, unfamiliarity, a stranger, separation, that would activate the attachment system enough to reveal how it was organized. And the critical behavioral window was not the separation itself, but the reunion. This was Ainsworth's fundamental insight, and it is easy to miss how counterintuitive it was. The natural assumption is that the most revealing moment is the separation. Does the child cry or not? But almost all infants are distressed by separation from their caregiver in an unfamiliar setting. Crying alone tells you little about individual differences. What distinguishes one child from another is what the child does when the caregiver walks back through the door. That moment of reunion forces the child to resolve a tension. I was distressed. The person I depend on left, and now they have returned. How the child navigates that moment reveals the strategy the child has built over months of daily interaction. From the Baltimore study, Ainsworth identified 3 primary patterns. The majority of infants, roughly 60 to 65% in her sample, were classified as securely attached. These children explored the room freely when the mother was present, showed visible distress during separation, and upon reunion actively sought contact with the mother. The critical feature was that contact with the mother was effective. The child sought her, was comforted, calmed down, and returned to play. The attachment system activated under stress and deactivated upon the restoration of proximity. The system worked the way Bowlby's theory predicted it should. A second group, roughly 20%, were classified as insecure avoidant. These children explored the toys readily, but showed little visible distress when the mother left. Upon reunion, they actively avoided her, turning away, looking at the floor, or moving toward toys instead of toward the mother. On the surface, they appeared independent and unbothered, which is exactly how hospital staff had once described detached children. Ainsworth's detailed home observations revealed what was behind this composure. The mothers of avoidant infants had consistently rebuffed or minimized the child's bids for closeness over the preceding months. The child had learned that signaling distress does not bring comfort. It brings rejection. The avoidance strategy was not indifference, but a conditional adjustment. Suppress the outward signals of need to maintain whatever proximity the caregiver will tolerate. The third group, roughly 10 to 15%, were classified as insecure resistant, sometimes called insecure ambivalent. These children were wary and clingy from the start, exploring little even when the mother was present. During separation, their distress was intense, but upon reunion they displayed a contradictory pattern. They sought contact with the mother while simultaneously resisting it. A resistant infant might reach to be picked up and then immediately arch away, or cry at the mother's return and refuse to be soothed. Home observations showed that these children had experienced inconsistent caregiving, sometimes responsive, sometimes unavailable, in no predictable pattern. The child could not rely on the caregiver being there, so the child's strategy was to maximize attachment signaling at all times. The system stayed activated because the child could never be confident it was safe to let it rest. Each of these patterns is a coherent strategy, not a deficit. The avoidant child has learned to suppress attachment behavior because expressing it leads to rejection. The resistant child has learned to amplify attachment behavior because the caregiver responds only to high-intensity signals. Both are adaptations to the specific caregiving environment the child actually received. Ainsworth showed that the strange situation was not simply a stress test. It was a window into the organizational logic of a relationship that had been built over the entire first year of life. But one problem was already visible in Ainsworth's own data. A small number of infants did not fit any of her 3 classifications. Their behavior during reunion was not avoidant, not resistant, and not securely organized. It was contradictory, fragmented, or simply bizarre, approaching the mother while looking in the opposite direction, freezing in mid-movement, or collapsing to the floor. Ainsworth could not classify these children within her system, and they were initially set aside. It would take one of her own graduate students to identify what these children were showing and why it mattered. Part 5. The fourth pattern. Mary Main was that graduate student, and her contribution changed the scope of attachment theory permanently. Main completed her doctoral work under Ainsworth and then started her own laboratory at the University of California, Berkeley, in the early 1970s. As she reviewed strange situation recordings from her own and others' samples, the unclassifiable cases kept demanding attention. These were not rare anomalies. In some high-risk samples, they constituted a substantial portion of the children observed. The behaviors themselves were striking because they lacked coherent organization. A child might begin walking toward the mother upon reunion, then suddenly stop and freeze with a dazed expression for several seconds. Another might approach the mother with hands raised, then veer away and fall prone to the floor. Some displayed simultaneous contradictory movements, reaching for the mother while backing away or turning in circles. Others showed stereotyped or asymmetric movements, rocking, ear-pulling, or sudden stilling that appeared unrelated to the social situation. What all these behaviors shared was that they occurred specifically during reunion episodes, not throughout the procedure. Main and her colleague Judith Solomon proposed in 1986 a fourth classification: disorganized, disoriented attachment. The logic of the classification rested on a precise theoretical observation. In Ainsworth's 3 organized patterns, the child has a coherent strategy for managing the stress of separation and reunion. The secure child seeks proximity. The avoidant child suppresses proximity seeking. The resistant child amplifies it. All 3 are organized responses to the problem of regulating proximity to the caregiver under stress. The disorganized child has no coherent strategy at all. To understand why, Mayne and her colleague Eric Hesse proposed a specific mechanism. They examined the caregiving histories of disorganized infants and found a striking pattern. The parents of these children were disproportionately likely to have histories of unresolved loss or unresolved trauma. Unresolved here means something precise. The parents' experience of loss or abuse had not been psychologically integrated. It continued to intrude into the parent's present-moment behavior in involuntary and often frightening ways. A parent with unresolved trauma might suddenly display a terrified facial expression for no visible reason, or move toward the child in an inexplicably threatening manner, or briefly dissociate, going blank and unresponsive during routine caregiving. This created an impossible situation for the infant, and the impossibility is the key to the entire classification. The attachment system, as Bowlby described it, drives the infant toward the caregiver when the infant is frightened. But what happens when the caregiver is the source of fear? The infant's biological program says, when afraid, go to the caregiver. The infant's experience says, the caregiver is what I am afraid of. The 2 imperatives collide, and the result is behavioral collapse, the approach that halts mid-stride, the reach that reverses, the freeze that interrupts all organized behavior. Think of it this way. A smoke alarm and a fire exit are supposed to work together. The alarm detects danger and drives you toward the exit. Now place the fire directly in front of the exit door. The alarm keeps sounding, telling you to move toward safety. But moving toward safety means moving toward the fire. You cannot resolve the conflict by choosing one option over the other. Both are simultaneously operative and mutually exclusive. What you get is not a strategy, but a breakdown in the capacity to produce a strategy. Mayne was careful to distinguish disorganized attachment from the other insecure patterns. Avoidant and resistant children have strategies that are costly but functional under the conditions they face. The avoidant child's suppression works to maintain tolerable proximity with a rejecting caregiver. The resistant child's amplification works to extract responses from an inconsistent caregiver. The disorganized child has no such solution available because no coherent behavioral strategy can resolve the paradox of fearing the figure you must approach for safety. This is why disorganized attachment carries the most severe clinical risk. It is not merely insecure, it represents a collapse in the very mechanism that the other insecure patterns, however imperfectly, manage to preserve. In low-risk, middle-class samples, roughly 5 to 10% of infants received the disorganized classification. In high-risk samples, families marked by parental substance abuse, domestic violence or maltreatment, the rate climbed to well over 40%. Longitudinal research found that disorganized attachment in infancy predicted elevated rates of behavioral problems, difficulties in emotion regulation, and what Main called controlling behavior toward the parent by age 6. Some formerly disorganized children became punitively controlling, ordering and directing the parent with hostility. Others became compulsively caregiving, taking on a solicitous parental role toward their own parent. Both strategies represented the child's attempt to manage a relationship that had failed to provide a reliable source of safety. The identification of disorganized attachment forced a reckoning with a limitation in the original theory. Ainsworth's three-category system assumed that all infants develop an organized attachment strategy of some kind. Main showed that when the caregiving environment is sufficiently frightening or unpredictable, organization itself can fail. The attachment system does not always produce a workable solution. Sometimes the conditions make a solution impossible. This raised an immediate question about what was happening at a deeper level, inside the child's developing mind. If the attachment system generates behavioral strategies based on caregiving experience, what is the mental structure that stores and deploys those strategies over time? Part 6. The map you did not know you were using. The behavioral patterns Ainsworth and Main observed in infants last only a few minutes in a laboratory. But attachment theory claims that their effects persist for years, sometimes for an entire lifetime. That claim requires an explanation of how early experience gets carried forward, and that explanation is the concept of the internal working model. Bowlby borrowed this concept not from psychoanalysis, but from a largely forgotten British philosopher and engineer named Kenneth Craik. In 1943, Craik proposed that organisms capable of complex behavior carry small-scale mental models of reality inside their heads. These models allow the organism to simulate possible events and evaluate possible actions without having to perform them in the real world. A rat that has explored a maze can later navigate it efficiently because it carries an internal model of the maze's structure. The better the model matches reality, the better the organism can predict what will happen next and plan accordingly. Craik argued that this capacity for internal modelling was a central evolutionary advantage of complex nervous systems. Bowlby applied Craik's concept to relationships. He proposed that over the first year of life, an infant builds mental models of two things simultaneously, the self and the caregiver. These models are not abstract beliefs stated in words. The infant does not yet have language. They are procedural patterns built from thousands of repeated interactions, encoding what happens when the infant signals a need. If the caregiver consistently responds when the infant cries, the infant builds a model of the caregiver as available and a model of the self as effective, as someone whose signals produce results. If the caregiver consistently ignores or rejects the infant's bids, the infant builds a model of the caregiver as unavailable and a model of the self as unworthy of response. These models then operate as filters on all incoming social information. They shape what the individual notices, how the individual interprets ambiguous social cues, and what the individual expects from new relationships. This filtering happens automatically below the level of conscious deliberation, which is precisely what makes working models so powerful and so difficult to change. You do not choose to apply the model any more than you choose to apply your knowledge of grammar when speaking a sentence. Here is what this looks like in practice. A woman in her 30s is sitting across from her partner at a kitchen table on a Tuesday evening. Her partner glances at his phone while she is describing a difficult interaction she had at work that day. 3 different internal working models would produce 3 very different reactions to this single ambiguous moment. If her working model encodes caregivers as generally available and herself as worthy of attention, she might feel a mild flicker of annoyance, say something direct like, "Hey, I'm telling you something important," and move on when he puts the phone down. The moment resolves quickly because her model predicts that bids for attention usually work. If her model encodes caregivers as unreliable and herself as needing to fight for attention, the phone glance might trigger a cascade of anxiety. He does not care. He never really listens. This relationship is not safe. She might escalate her emotional tone or become accusatory, not because the situation warrants it, but because her model is generating a prediction of abandonment from an ambiguous cue. If her model encodes caregivers as rejecting and herself as someone who should not need help, she might feel a flash of hurt, immediately suppress it, and change the subject to something less vulnerable. She does not protest the phone glance because her model tells her that expressing needs leads to rejection. In each case, the woman is responding not only to what is actually happening, but to what her working model predicts is about to happen. The model fills in the gaps of ambiguous situations with expectations built from hundreds of prior interactions, many of them from childhood. This is why 2 people can witness the same event in a relationship and experience it as fundamentally different situations. They are not perceiving the same thing. Their working models are constructing different realities from the same data. Bowlby argued that working models are relatively stable once formed, for 2 reinforcing reasons. First, the models operate outside conscious awareness, which means they are rarely examined or questioned directly. Second, the models tend to be self-confirming. A person whose model predicts rejection may behave in ways that elicit rejection, withdrawing preemptively, testing the partner's commitment, interpreting neutral behavior as hostile, thereby confirming the very prediction the model generated. The model creates the conditions for its own verification, a process that can run for decades without the person recognizing it is happening. This is how a pattern formed in the first year of life can shape a marriage at 40. But Bowlby also insisted that working models are called working for a reason. They are subject to revision. New relationship experiences that consistently contradict the old model can, over time, update it. A person raised with an avoidant model who enters a relationship with a consistently responsive partner may gradually develop new expectations, though the process is slow and rarely complete. The question of how much and under what conditions working models actually change would become one of the most contested issues in the entire field. The internal working model was a powerful theoretical move because it solved a problem that purely behavioral descriptions could not. Ainsworth's strange situation classifications described what infants do, but working models explain what infants carry forward They are the mechanism by which a 20-minute observation in a laboratory at 12 months can have any relevance to a 30-year-old's experience of romantic jealousy. But this immediately raised a further question. If working models are mental representations stored inside one individual's mind, how could they possibly cross the boundary between two people? How does a mother's working model get into her child? Part 7. The Interview and the Inheritance. Mary Main tackled this question with a method that no one in the attachment field had attempted before. Instead of observing infants, she asked adults to talk about their own childhoods. The instrument she developed with her students Carol George and Nancy Kaplan in the mid-1980s was called the Adult Attachment Interview. It is a semi-structured interview lasting roughly 1 hour, and its design reflects a specific and unusual theoretical bet. The interview asks adults to describe their early relationships with their parents in general terms, and then to provide specific memories that support those descriptions. It asks about experiences of rejection, upset, separation, loss, and abuse. It asks whether the adult felt their childhood experiences affected their adult personality. And it asks them to speculate on why their parents behaved as they did. The questions themselves are straightforward. What makes the adult attachment interview distinctive is how the responses are scored. The scoring system does not evaluate what happened to the person. It evaluates how coherently the person can talk about what happened. This is the central and most surprising feature of the instrument, and it requires careful explanation because it is easy to misunderstand. Main was not interested in whether someone had a happy or unhappy childhood. She was interested in whether the person could provide a narrative that was internally consistent, supported by specific evidence, and neither excessively brief nor excessively detailed. Coherence of discourse, not content of experience, was the variable being measured. Main drew this criterion from the philosopher Paul Grice's maxims of cooperative communication. Grice had proposed that effective communication depends on being truthful, being relevant, being appropriately concise, and being clear. Main applied these maxims to how adults narrate their attachment histories and found that people vary dramatically in their ability to meet them. Some adults provide accounts that are clear, balanced, and supported by memory, whether or not the childhood described was a good one. Others provide accounts riddled with contradictions, vague generalities unsupported by any specific recollection, or sudden floods of detail that overwhelm the narrative. The particular ways in which coherence breaks down turned out to predict something remarkable. Adults classified as secure autonomous on the adult attachment interview could discuss their childhoods openly, acknowledge difficulties without being overwhelmed by them, and value attachment relationships explicitly. Their narratives were coherent whether the childhood described was positive or negative. Adults classified as dismissing tended to provide brief, uninformative responses, idealized their parents with generalities like, "She was great, totally normal," while being unable to produce supporting memories, or actively dismissed the importance of attachment. Their narratives violated Grice's maxims through excessive brevity and unsupported claims. Adults, classified as preoccupied, became entangled in their descriptions, veering into long, confused, and emotionally charged accounts that wandered from the question asked. They violated coherence through excessive, uncontrolled detail and an inability to maintain perspective on their own experience. The finding that made the adult attachment interview famous was the strength of its predictive link to the infant's strange situation. Secure, autonomous parents were far more likely to have securely attached infants. Dismissing parents were more likely to have avoidant infants. Preoccupied parents were more likely to have resistant infants. And adults classified as unresolved, those who showed sudden lapses in coherence when discussing loss or trauma, such as speaking of a dead person in the present tense or attributing magical causation to a death, were significantly more likely to have disorganized infants. In some studies, the match between a parent's unresolved classification and their infant's disorganized classification reached approximately 80%. The direction of this prediction is critical to grasp. Researchers administered the adult attachment interview to parents before their infants were born, and then observed the infants in the strange situation at 12 months. A parent's narrative coherence about their own childhood, assessed before the child existed, predicted how that child would behave during reunion with that parent a year later. The parent's internal working model, as revealed through the structure of their storytelling, was shaping the infant's attachment before the infant had even formed one. This was the strongest evidence yet for intergenerational transmission of attachment. The mechanism appeared to run from the parent's mental representations through their caregiving behavior to the infant's developing attachment organization. A parent who can reflect coherently on their own childhood, even a painful one, is more likely to respond sensitively to their infant's attachment signals. A parent whose narrative is confused or shut down is more likely to respond in ways that produce insecure or disorganized attachment in the child. The transmission does not require that the parent's childhood was good. It requires that the parent has made sense of whatever childhood they had. But a significant statistical puzzle remained inside this finding. Parental sensitivity, as measured by researchers, could not fully account for the link between a parent's interview classification and their infant's attachment pattern. The parent's working model predicted the infant's attachment better than the parent's observed behavior did. Something beyond what researchers could directly see in the parent's behavior was crossing the generational boundary, and no one could yet identify what that something was. Part 8. The cycle that runs without permission. The gap between the parent's mental state and the infant's attachment pattern, with observed caregiving behavior unable to fully bridge the distance between them, became known as the transmission gap. It is one of the most important unresolved problems in attachment research, and it points to something operating beneath the level of behavior that trained observers can readily code. Consider what the transmission gap actually implies. A researcher watches a mother interacting with her infant during feeding, play, and distress. The researcher rates how quickly the mother notices the infant's signals, how accurately she reads them, and how appropriately she responds. This sensitivity rating predicts the infant's attachment classification to some degree. Sensitive mothers tend to have secure infants. But the prediction is weaker than expected. The mother's adult attachment interview classification, a measure of how she talks about her own childhood in the absence of the infant, predicts the infant's attachment pattern more powerfully than anything the researcher can observe her actually doing with the child. One explanation that Main and Hesse proposed centers on behaviors too fleeting and subtle for standard coding systems to capture. They identified what they called frightened or frightening parental behavior as a potential hidden mediator. These are micro-level events. A parent's face goes momentarily blank during a diaper change. A parent's voice takes on a sudden threatening quality for half a second before returning to normal. A parent's hand hovers over the infant's face in an inexplicable gesture that lasts a fraction of a moment. These events are brief enough to escape the notice of a typical behavioral coding protocol, but the infant experiences every one of them, and if they occur repeatedly, they create exactly the paradox that produces disorganized attachment, the caregiver as simultaneous source of safety and source of alarm. Think of what this means for a 6-month-old lying on a changing table. The parent is performing a routine task, speaking in a normal voice, handling the child competently. Then, for 2 seconds, the parent's expression shifts to a vacant stare or a sudden grimace triggered by a traumatic memory surfacing involuntarily. The infant cannot understand what just happened, but the infant's perceptual system registers the shift. The caregiver's face, which one moment was the most reassuring stimulus in the infant's world, has become unreadable or frightening. A trained observer watching from behind a one-way mirror at normal speed might miss it entirely. The infant who is focused on nothing but that face does not miss it. It lands on a nervous system that is still being built and has no way to file the experience as anything other than an unexplained rupture in safety. Research on frightened and frightening parental behavior has found that it partially mediates the link between a parent's unresolved trauma and their infant's disorganized attachment. But partially is the operative word. Even when these subtle parental behaviors are accounted for, a substantial portion of the transmission gap remains unexplained. The parent's state of mind regarding attachment continues to predict the infant's attachment beyond what any observed parental behavior can account for. Several hypotheses compete to explain the remaining gap. One possibility is that existing measures of parental sensitivity are too crude to capture what actually matters. Standard sensitivity scales rate behavior in broad categories: prompt versus delayed response, appropriate versus inappropriate reading of signals. They may be missing dimensions of the interaction that are crucial, such as the timing, rhythm, and contingency structure of moment-to-moment exchanges. The parent's capacity to match the infant's emotional state at a microtemporal level, to pause when the infant pauses, to escalate affect when the infant escalates, may matter more than global sensitivity ratings can detect. If so, the gap is partly an artifact of measurement limitations, not a genuine mystery about the mechanism. Another possibility involves what the developmental psychologist Peter Fonagy calls mentalization, or reflective functioning. This is the parent's capacity to treat the infant as a being with its own mental states, to think about what the infant might be thinking or feeling. A parent high in reflective functioning does not just respond to the infant's behavior. She responds to the mental state she infers behind the behavior. When the infant cries, this parent does not merely pick the child up. She wonders whether the cry signals hunger, fatigue, overstimulation, or a need for comfort and adjusts accordingly. Reflective functioning is strongly correlated with adult attachment interview coherence and has been shown to predict infant attachment. It may capture something about the parent's internal engagement with the child that standard behavioral observation misses. A third possibility is that what crosses the generational boundary is not any single behavior or set of behaviors, but something more like an emotional atmosphere. The parent's unresolved states of mind may create pervasive qualities of the caregiving environment that influence the child chronically rather than through discrete events. The background level of anxiety in a household, the degree to which emotional experience is acknowledged or suppressed, the extent to which the parent can tolerate the child's distress without becoming overwhelmed. These qualities may be too diffuse to show up in a behavioral coding system, but potent enough to shape the infant's developing attachment organization. What all these explanations share is the recognition that something is being transmitted that cannot yet be fully observed or measured. The parent's internal world is reaching the child through channels that current research methods can detect only partially. This is not a failure of attachment theory. It is a statement about where the frontier of the theory currently sits. The intergenerational transmission of attachment is one of the most robust findings in developmental psychology. The mechanism by which that transmission occurs is one of the most important things developmental psychology has not yet fully explained. But there is something that can be said with confidence about the transmission process as a whole. It operates largely without the conscious knowledge or consent of the parent. A mother with a dismissing attachment classification does not decide to rebuff her infant's bids for contact. She does so because her own working model, built in her own infancy and reinforced across her lifetime, generates an automatic response to the infant's attachment signals that she may not even register as a choice. The cycle runs in the same way that a native speaker's grammar runs, fluently, automatically, and almost entirely outside the reach of deliberate control. The child inherits not the parent's experiences, but the parent's way of organizing experience, encoded in a working model that was never chosen and rarely examined. This raises a question that carries both theoretical and deeply human weight. If the cycle is unconscious and self-perpetuating, is it possible to break it? Can a person who grew up with insecure attachment develop secure attachment as an adult? And if so, what does it take? Part 9. Love as an attachment process. For the first 3 decades of its existence, attachment theory was a theory about infants and children. Bowlby himself believed that the attachment system operates across the entire lifespan, but the research remained anchored in the nursery and the strange situation. The extension to adult life came from an unexpected direction. Not from developmental psychology, but from social psychology, and not from a clinical setting, but from a newspaper survey. In 1987, Cindy Hazan and Philip Shaver published a paper that asked a question so straightforward it is surprising no one had asked it systematically before. If attachment is a biological system that evolved to maintain proximity to a protective figure, and if Bowlby was right that this system operates from the cradle to the grave, then adult romantic love should show the same structural features as infant attachment. Not the same behaviours. Adults do not crawl toward their partners or cry when left at daycare, but the same underlying functional organisation. the same system expressed through the behavioral repertoire available to an adult. Hazan and Shaver identified three functional components that infant attachment and adult romantic love share. First, proximity seeking. Infants want to be near the caregiver, and adults want to be near the romantic partner, particularly under stress. Second, safe haven. Infants turn to the caregiver for comfort when frightened, and adults turn to the partner for emotional support during distress. Third, secure base. Infants use the caregiver as a platform from which to explore the environment, and adults use the confidence of a stable relationship as a foundation for pursuing work, friendships, and personal goals. Hazan and Shaver argued that these are not merely analogies. They are the same behavioral system deploying the same functional logic toward a different target. To test this, they designed a simple self-report measure. They wrote 3 short paragraphs, each describing a characteristic way of experiencing romantic relationships, and asked respondents to choose the one that best fit them. One paragraph described comfort with closeness, ease in depending on others, and a lack of worry about abandonment. The second described discomfort with intimacy, difficulty trusting, and nervousness when anyone got too close. The third described a desire for extreme closeness that scared partners away, chronic worry about not being loved enough, and emotional volatility in relationships. These were adult translations of Ainsworth's secure, avoidant, and resistant classifications. The initial results, gathered partly through a questionnaire printed in a Denver newspaper, were striking in their alignment with infant data. Approximately 56% of respondents identified with the secure description, roughly 25% with the avoidant, and roughly 20% with the anxious resistant. These proportions roughly matched the distributions Ainsworth had found among infants in the strange situation decades earlier. Moreover, the 3 groups of adults differed in predictable ways in how they described their romantic relationships. Secure adults described their most important love experience as happy, friendly, and trusting. Avoidant adults reported fear of closeness and emotional highs and lows. Anxious adults described obsessive preoccupation with the partner, desire for extreme closeness, and intense jealousy. Each pattern echoed the relational logic of its infant counterpart, expressed through the vocabulary of adult emotional life. Hazan and Shaver also found that attachment style was related in theoretically coherent ways to how adults described their childhood relationships with parents. Secure adults were more likely to describe their parents as warm and responsive. Avoidant adults were more likely to describe their mothers as cold and rejecting. Anxious adults were more likely to describe their fathers as unfair and their family environments as unpredictable. The pattern was consistent with the central claim of attachment theory, that early caregiving experience shapes the internal working model, which then organizes adult relationship behavior. The 1987 paper opened an entire research program virtually overnight. Within a few years, hundreds of studies were examining adult attachment in relation to relationship satisfaction, communication patterns, sexual behavior, caregiving, jealousy, conflict resolution, and breakup distress. But the original measure had a significant limitation that became apparent quickly. Forcing people to choose one of 3 paragraphs treats attachment as a categorical variable. You are either secure, avoidant, or anxious, with nothing in between. This did not match the clinical or empirical reality that people vary in degree, not just in kind. A person might be slightly avoidant in one relationship context and moderately anxious in another. The categorical approach could not capture this variation, and it was generating artificial boundary problems in research. The field needed a different way of thinking about individual differences in adult attachment. Part 10. The Two Dimensions. The move from categories to dimensions began with a basic statistical observation. When researchers analyzed large datasets of self-reported attachment experiences, the responses did not cluster neatly into 3 or 4 distinct groups. Instead, they spread out along 2 continuous axes that seemed to capture the underlying structure of adult attachment variation more accurately than any set of categories could. Kim Bartholomew, working in the early 1990s, proposed a 4-category model that clarified the dimensional structure. She noted that Bowlby's concept of working models involves 2 components, a model of the self and a model of others. The model of the self can be broadly positive, I am worthy of love and attention, or broadly negative, I am not worthy, I am inadequate. The model of others can be broadly positive. Other people are trustworthy and available, or broadly negative. Crossing these 2 dimensions produces 4 quadrants, each corresponding to a recognizable attachment orientation. A positive self-model combined with a positive other model yields secure attachment. A negative self-model with a positive other model yields preoccupied attachment. The person desperately seeks closeness because they doubt their own worth but believe others could provide it. A positive self-model with a negative other model yields dismissing attachment. The person maintains self-esteem by denying the importance of relationships with others who are seen as unreliable, and a negative self-model with a negative other model yields fearful attachment. The person both desires closeness and expects rejection, resulting in chronic approach-avoidance conflict. Bartholomew's model was important because it split Hazan and Shaver's original avoidant category into 2 distinct patterns with different internal logics. Dismissing avoidance and fearful avoidance look similar on the surface, both involve keeping emotional distance, but the reasons are different. The dismissing person avoids closeness because they have defensively concluded they do not need it. The fearful person avoids closeness because they want it intensely, but expect it to end in pain. This distinction had clinical implications that the original 3-category system could not capture. The most influential dimensional model came from the work of Kelly Brennan, Catherine Clark, and Philip Shaver in 1998. They collected every self-report attachment item they could find in the existing literature, administered them to a large sample, and factor-analyzed the results. 2 dimensions emerged cleanly from the data. The first was attachment anxiety, the degree to which a person worries about being abandoned, rejected, or insufficiently loved. The second was attachment avoidance, the degree to which a person is uncomfortable with closeness, emotional dependence, and intimate self-disclosure. Every individual falls somewhere on each of these 2 continua simultaneously. A person low in both anxiety and avoidance is securely attached, comfortable with closeness, not preoccupied with rejection. A person high in anxiety but low in avoidance is preoccupied, desperate for closeness, chronically worried about losing it. A person low in anxiety but high in avoidance is dismissing, self-reliant, emotionally distant, untroubled by solitude. A person high in both is fearful, wanting connection but paralyzed by the expectation of hurt. The categories from Bartholomew's model still exist, but now they are regions in a continuous two-dimensional space rather than rigid boxes. This dimensional model transformed the precision of adult attachment research. Instead of asking whether a person is secure or insecure, researchers could now ask how anxious and how avoidant, yielding far more nuanced predictions. Studies using these dimensions consistently found that attachment anxiety predicts emotional volatility in relationships, hyperactivation of distress signals, rumination after conflict, and difficulty disengaging from relationship threats. Attachment avoidance predicts suppression of emotional experience, discomfort with partner dependence, withdrawal during conflict, and difficulty providing emotional support when the partner is distressed. Here is what the two dimensions look like in a single specific moment. Two people are in a committed relationship, and one of them receives a text message late at night from an unfamiliar number on the other person's phone. A person high in attachment anxiety might feel an immediate surge of threat. Who is this? Are they being replaced? Is the relationship in danger? And respond with urgent questioning, checking, or accusation. A person high in attachment avoidance might notice the text, feel a brief flash of discomfort, and decide not to mention it, pulling back emotionally and becoming slightly more distant over the following days without ever naming why. A person low on both dimensions might feel a moment of curiosity, bring it up casually, hear the explanation, and let it go. The same event, the same ambiguous stimulus, processes through different positions on the two dimensions and produces visibly different relational behavior. One important finding from the dimensional approach is that these two dimensions are largely independent of each other. You can be high in anxiety without being high in avoidance, and vice versa. This independence means that the two dimensions likely reflect distinct regulatory processes. Anxiety appears to reflect the degree to which the attachment system's threat monitoring function is chronically activated, how easily the system detects potential rejection, and how strongly it signals alarm. Avoidance appears to reflect the degree to which the attachment system's proximity-seeking function is chronically suppressed, how thoroughly the person has learned to inhibit bids for closeness and manage distress alone. The securely attached person has a system that activates when genuinely threatened and deactivates when comfort is restored. The anxious person's system activates too easily and too intensely. The avoidant person's system is suppressed so effectively that even genuine threats may not activate a bid for support. The dimensional model brought adult attachment research into closer alignment with personality psychology and gave researchers a common metric for comparing across studies. But it also sharpened a question the field had been circling for years. All of this research, from Ainsworth's Baltimore Homes to Brennan's factor analyses, was conducted overwhelmingly with Western-educated middle-class populations. If attachment is supposed to be a universal biological system, then the theory needs to hold up when you leave Baltimore and Denver behind. Part 11. The Culture Problem. The strongest version of the cross-cultural critique of attachment theory was articulated by Fred Rothbaum and colleagues in the year 2000. Their argument targeted not a peripheral detail, but the theory's three core hypotheses simultaneously. They chose Japan as their primary comparison case, not to suggest Japan is exotic, but because Japan represents a well-studied, industrialized society with child-rearing values that diverge substantially from those of the American middle class. The first hypothesis they challenged was the sensitivity hypothesis, that caregivers who are sensitive and responsive to infant signals produce securely attached children. Rothbaum's group pointed out that the operational definition of sensitivity used in attachment research emphasizes the caregiver's support of the child's autonomy and independent exploration. A sensitive mother, as Ainsworth defined her, reads the child's signals accurately and responds promptly, but she also respects the child's initiative and does not intrude. In the American middle-class context, where the concept was developed, this definition seems natural and value-neutral. In Japan, Rothbaum argued, good mothering looks different. Japanese mothers are more likely to anticipate their infant's needs before the infant signals, more likely to maintain constant physical contact, and more likely to prioritize the child's dependence on the mother over early independence. By the American sensitivity scale, this could register as intrusiveness. By Japanese parenting standards, it is attentive care. The second hypothesis they challenged was the competence hypothesis, that securely attached children develop greater social competence later in life. Attachment researchers typically measure competence in terms of exploration, assertiveness, social confidence with peers, and emotional autonomy. These are traits valued in individualist societies. In Japan, social competence is more likely to be defined by harmony with the group, sensitivity to others' feelings, restraint of self-assertion, and the capacity for what the Japanese psychoanalyst Takeo Doi called ame. Trusting dependence on others. If competence means something different in a different culture, then the claim that secure attachment leads to competence may be true only within the value system where the terms were defined. The third hypothesis was the secure base hypothesis itself, that secure attachment enables the child to use the caregiver as a launching point for bold exploration of the world. Rothbaum argued that in Japan, the primary function of security is not to promote exploration and independence, but to promote interdependence and social accommodation. The securely attached Japanese child may not be the one who ventures farthest from the mother. It may be the one who stays closest, who reads the mother's emotional state most accurately, and who adjusts behavior to maintain relational harmony. If this is correct, then what attachment theorists call secure base behavior, the child leaving the mother to explore, is not a universal expression of security, but a culturally specific one. Rothbaum's critique had real empirical ammunition. When the strange situation was conducted with Japanese infants, the distribution of attachment classifications looked markedly different from American samples. Japanese infants showed very high rates of resistant attachment and very low rates of avoidant attachment. The standard interpretation within attachment theory was that Japanese infants were overrepresented in the resistant category because Japanese mothers rarely leave their infants for strangers, making the strange situation procedure unusually stressful for those particular children. Rothbaum asked a sharper question. Is it the Japanese children who are atypical, or is it the measuring instrument that assumes American norms? If the strange situation is calibrated to detect secure-based behavior as defined by Western values of exploration and autonomy, then a child who expresses security through closeness and dependence may be systematically misclassified. The counter-arguments to Rothbaum were also substantial, and they came quickly. Marinus van Eisendorn and Abraham Sagi-Schwartz led the most prominent empirical response, drawing on a large meta-analysis of strange situation data from multiple countries. Their central finding was that secure attachment was the majority classification in nearly every culture studied, not just Western ones. The cross-cultural variation that existed was primarily in the distribution of insecure subtypes, not in the overall prevalence of security. German infants showed more avoidance than American infants, and Japanese infants showed more resistance, but in both cases secure attachment remained the most common pattern. This suggested that the basic phenomenon Bowlby described, a normative bias towards security when conditions are adequate, holds across cultures even if the specific insecure patterns vary with local child-rearing practices. Defenders of the theory also pointed to studies conducted with Japanese mothers that directly contradicted Rothbaum's characterization. When Japanese mothers were asked to rank the desirability of different child behaviors using attachment-relevant measures, they preferred secure base behavior over dependent behavior. They did not, as Rothbaum's argument implied, value ame over security. This finding suggested that Rothbaum may have conflated Japanese cultural ideals with actual maternal preferences in a way that the data did not support. But the critique left a mark that honest assessment of the field must acknowledge. The strange situation was developed with American middle-class families, and its behavioral coding system was built on assumptions about what healthy infant behavior looks like in that context. The cross-cultural meta-analysis, while showing majority secure classifications globally, drew most of its data from Western industrialized nations. Entire regions of the world, including most of sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and indigenous populations everywhere, were either absent from the dataset or represented by tiny samples. The claim that attachment theory is cross-culturally valid rests on evidence that is far more geographically narrow than the claim itself. The most balanced reading of the evidence is this. The biological substrate of attachment, the infant's tendency to seek proximity to a caregiver when threatened, is almost certainly universal because it is an evolved adaptation to a problem every human infant faces. But the specific behaviors that express attachment, the caregiving practices that promote security, and the developmental outcomes that security predicts may all be shaped by cultural context, in ways the theory has not yet fully incorporated. Attachment theory is not wrong about the existence of the system. It may be incomplete about the range of forms the system can take. Part 12. The Transmission Gap. Return now to the problem introduced at the end of Part 7, because it sits at the center of what attachment theory has not yet solved. The intergenerational transmission of attachment is among the most replicated findings in developmental psychology. A meta-analysis by Marinus van Eijzendoorn in 1995, covering over 600 parent-infant pairs across 13 studies, found that 75% of parents and infants received matching secure versus insecure classifications. The correspondence is robust, and it runs in the predicted direction. But here is the gap. When researchers measure the specific parental behavior that is supposed to carry the transmission, maternal sensitivity, it accounts for far less of the link than expected. A meta-analysis by Marion Bakemans-Kranenberg, Van Eijzendoorn, and Femi Juffer found that sensitivity explained only a modest portion of the association between a parent's adult attachment interview classification and the infant's strange situation classification. Something else must be mediating the connection, and despite decades of searching, researchers have not definitively identified what it is. Multiple candidates have been proposed, and each captures a piece of the puzzle without completing it. The frightened and frightening parental behavior identified by Main and Hesse accounts for some of the link to disorganized attachment specifically, but does not explain the broader transmission across all attachment categories. Fonagi's concept of reflective functioning captures something important about the parent's capacity to engage with the infant's mental states, but its statistical contribution to closing the gap has been partial. Mine-mindedness, a related concept developed by Elizabeth Mines, measures the parent's tendency to describe the infant in terms of mental states rather than physical characteristics. She is curious about that toy, rather than she is grabbing at that toy. Parents who are more mind-minded tend to have more securely attached infants, but again, this variable narrows the gap without closing it. Some researchers have argued that the gap is partly a measurement problem, not a theoretical one. Sensitivity is typically measured during relatively brief observation periods, sometimes as short as 15 minutes. But the infant's working model is built from thousands of hours of interaction across the entire first year of life. A 15-minute observation may not sample the behaviors that matter most, or it may catch the parent on an unrepresentative day. If researchers could observe the full texture of the parent-infant relationship over months rather than minutes, the gap might shrink substantially. Ainsworth's original Baltimore study, which involved extensive home observation, found a stronger link between sensitivity and attachment than almost any subsequent study using briefer observations. This suggests that the way sensitivity has been measured in most research may be too coarse to capture the phenomenon adequately. Others have proposed that the gap reflects the operation of genetic factors that attachment theory has historically underemphasized. The child is not a blank surface onto which the parent's working model is projected. The child arrives with a temperament, a biologically based profile of reactivity and self-regulation that influences how strongly the child responds to stress, how easily the child is soothed, and how intensely the child signals distress. If an infant with a highly reactive temperament is harder to soothe, then even a sensitive parent may appear less effective, and the infant may develop a less secure attachment for reasons partly independent of caregiving quality. Temperament researchers like Jerome Kagan argued for decades that what attachment theorists attributed to caregiving was at least partly a reflection of the infant's inborn disposition. The evidence on temperament and attachment is genuinely mixed. Infant temperament does predict some aspects of strange situation behavior, particularly the intensity of distress during separation. But it is a weak predictor of attachment classification itself. A highly reactive infant is not more likely to be classified as insecure. The infant is more likely to cry during separation, but the classification depends on what happens during reunion, which is shaped by the relationship, not by temperament alone. The most current view holds that temperament and caregiving interact. A difficult temperament may make sensitive caregiving harder to sustain, and insensitive caregiving may be more damaging for a temperamentally vulnerable infant. Neither factor alone determines attachment. The outcome emerges from the transaction between them. The transmission gap remains genuinely open after more than 3 decades of dedicated research. This is not a minor technical problem. It touches the core mechanism the theory proposes. If attachment theory claims that the parent's internal working model shapes the infant's attachment through caregiving behavior, and if caregiving behavior as currently measured cannot account for the full strength of that shaping, then either the theory's mechanism is incomplete, or our ability to observe the mechanism is inadequate. Both possibilities are live, and the field has not yet determined which carries more weight. Part 13. Earned security. The transmission gap concerns how attachment moves between people. An equally important question is whether it can change within a single person across the lifespan. Bowlby's theory predicted relative stability. Working models, once formed, tend to persist because they operate automatically and generate self-confirming patterns of behavior. But Bowlby also insisted the models are working, dynamic, updatable, open in principle to revision through new experience. The question is whether that theoretical openness translates into actual change in real human lives. The strongest evidence that it does comes from a phenomenon Mayne herself identified in her adult attachment interview data. Some adults who described clearly difficult childhoods, rejection, neglect, inconsistency, even abuse, nonetheless received a secure autonomous classification on the interview. Their childhoods were not happy, but their narratives were coherent. They could describe what happened to them with clarity, acknowledge the pain without being overwhelmed by it, and reflect on how those experiences had shaped them. Mayne called this pattern earned security, distinguishing it from continuous security, which characterized adults who had both positive childhoods and coherent narratives. The distinction was not trivial, because earned secure adults looked functionally equivalent to continuously secure adults on nearly every measure that mattered. Their infants were just as likely to be classified as securely attached in the strange situation. Their romantic relationships showed similar levels of satisfaction and stability. Their capacity to respond sensitively to their own children was comparable. Whatever process had transformed their insecure early experience into a coherent adult narrative had real consequences for how they functioned in relationships. The cycle had been interrupted. How does earned security develop? The research is less precise on this question than on the phenomenon itself, but several factors recur across studies. Close relationships with alternative attachment figures, a grandparent, a teacher, a romantic partner, a therapist, appear consistently in the histories of earned secure adults. These relationships seem to provide a corrective emotional experience, one that contradicts the expectations encoded in the original working model. If your model predicts that bids for closeness will be rejected, and you encounter someone who consistently does not reject them, the model comes under pressure to update. This does not happen quickly or easily. Working models resist change precisely because they filter incoming information in ways that favor their own confirmation. But sustained, contradictory relational experience, especially when it occurs in a relationship that is emotionally significant, can gradually revise the model. Therapy appears to be another pathway. Longitudinal studies have found that some adults shift from insecure to secure attachment classifications over periods of years, and these shifts are sometimes associated with therapeutic intervention. The mechanism is consistent with what the theory would predict. Therapy provides a relationship with a consistently responsive, attuned figure, the therapist, who functions in some ways like an attachment figure. Within that relationship, the client can begin to examine their working model explicitly, notice the patterns it generates, and experiment with alternative ways of interpreting and responding to relational situations. Over time, the new patterns may become sufficiently consolidated to function as a revised working model. But earned security raises a theoretical complication that the field has not fully resolved. If working models can be revised through new experience, then the claim that early attachment has lasting influence is weakened. If they cannot be easily revised, then the claim that change is possible is weakened. Attachment theory needs both claims to be true simultaneously: lasting influence and the possibility of change, and the relationship between them is not yet precisely specified. How much change is possible, for whom, under what conditions, and at what cost remains an area where clinical intuition runs well ahead of controlled evidence. There is a further question about what earned security actually represents at the level of the mind. Does the earned secure adult develop a genuinely new working model that replaces the old one? Or does the old model persist, held in check by a newer, more adaptive model that overrides it under most conditions, but may resurface under extreme stress? Some evidence favors the second interpretation. Studies using implicit measures, tasks that tap automatic, uncontrolled processing rather than deliberate reflection, have found that earned, secure adults sometimes show insecure responses at the implicit level, even when their explicit narratives are coherent and secure. This suggests that the original working model may not be erased so much as supplemented by a competing model that wins most of the time, but not all of it. If this is correct, then earned security is not the replacement of an old map with a new one. It is the capacity to navigate using two maps simultaneously, choosing the more accurate one in most situations while remaining vulnerable to the old one under conditions of high stress, fatigue, or emotional flooding. This would explain a clinical observation that many therapists report. Clients who have done significant therapeutic work and function securely in most contexts can nonetheless find themselves pulled back into old patterns during a crisis, a painful breakup, or a period of extreme stress. The old model was never deleted. It was overridden. Earned security matters far beyond the laboratory because it answers the question that the intergenerational transmission findings make urgent. If attachment patterns are passed from parent to child through unconscious mechanisms, the implication could be fatalistic. Your childhood determined you, and you will repeat it with your children. Earned security refutes that fatalism empirically. It shows that the cycle can be broken, that a person who received insecure caregiving can develop a coherent relationship with their own history and provide secure caregiving to their children. The determining factor is not what happened to you. It is whether you have made sense of what happened to you. Part 14. The Clinic and the Couch. Attachment theory was never intended to remain in the laboratory. Bowlby was a clinician before he was a researcher, and his theory was built on the observation that real children in real institutions were suffering real harm. The clinical applications of attachment theory have expanded enormously since the 1990s, and they have taken two broadly different forms: interventions aimed at the parent-child relationship and therapies designed for adults. The parent-child interventions follow directly from the theory's core mechanism. If insecure attachment results from insensitive caregiving, and if caregiving behavior can be improved, then intervening at the level of the parent should improve the child's attachment security. The most rigorously tested intervention in this category is the video feedback intervention to promote positive parenting and sensitive discipline, developed by a team at Leiden University in the Netherlands. The method is deceptively simple. A clinician films a parent interacting with their child, then reviews selected clips with the parent, highlighting moments of sensitive responsiveness and pointing out opportunities that were missed. The parent sees their own behavior from the outside and begins to notice patterns they could not detect while inside the interaction. The intervention is brief, typically 6 to 8 sessions, and it has been tested in multiple randomized controlled trials across different populations. A meta-analysis of the first 25 such trials found that the intervention increased parental sensitivity and reduced both disorganized and insecure attachment in the children. The effects were maintained at follow-up assessments, suggesting they were not transient. This is meaningful evidence because it closes a causal loop that observational research alone cannot close. Observational studies can show that sensitivity and security co-occur, but only an intervention that experimentally increases sensitivity and then observes a corresponding increase in security can demonstrate that the relationship is causal, not merely correlational. A related intervention, the Attachment and Biobehavioral Catch-up Program developed by Mary Dozier, targets foster parents and other caregivers of high-risk children. This program trains caregivers to override their natural inclinations when those inclinations conflict with the child's attachment needs. A foster parent whose new charge pushes them away or avoids eye contact may instinctively give the child space, interpreting the avoidance as a request for distance. The program teaches the parent that avoidant behavior in these children is not a preference for solitude, but a learned strategy developed in response to prior rejection. The appropriate response is not to back away, but to move gently toward the child, providing the consistent nurturance the child's working model does not yet expect. Randomized trials of this program have found improvements in attachment security and reductions in disorganized attachment in intervention groups compared to controls. On the adult side, attachment theory has influenced psychotherapy in several distinct ways. the most direct influence is on the therapeutic relationship itself. Many contemporary therapies explicitly conceptualize the therapist as functioning like a temporary attachment figure. The therapist provides a consistent, responsive, non-judgmental presence, the conditions that promote secure attachment. And within that relationship, the client can begin to explore painful experiences that were previously too threatening to approach. This is not a metaphor. Research has found that clients' attachment to their therapist follows patterns predicted by attachment theory, and that the security of the therapeutic alliance predicts treatment outcomes across multiple types of therapy. Mentalization-based treatment, developed by Peter Fonagy and Anthony Bateman, draws explicitly on attachment theory and was originally designed for individuals with borderline personality disorder. The core premise is that many of the emotional and interpersonal difficulties these individuals experience stem from impaired mentalizing capacity. The ability to understand behavior in terms of underlying mental states in oneself and others. Fonagy linked this impairment directly to early attachment disruption. Children who grow up with caregivers who do not reflect their mental states back to them fail to develop a robust capacity for reflective functioning. The treatment aims to rebuild this capacity within the therapeutic relationship through a specific focus on identifying, naming and understanding mental states as they arise in real time during therapy sessions. Emotionally focused therapy, developed by Sue Johnson, applies attachment theory directly to couple relationships. Johnson conceptualizes relationship distress as the activation of the attachment system in both partners, with each partner's insecure strategies triggering and reinforcing the others. A common pattern she identifies is the pursue-withdraw cycle. One partner, high in attachment anxiety, escalates emotional demands in response to perceived distance, while the other, high in attachment avoidance, withdraws in response to perceived emotional pressure. Each person's strategy is a logical response to the other person's strategy, and the cycle is self-perpetuating. The therapy aims to help both partners identify the attachment needs and fears underneath their surface behaviors, express those needs directly, and respond to each other's vulnerability rather than to each other's defensive strategies. Randomized controlled trials of emotionally focused therapy have shown sustained improvements in relationship satisfaction, with effects maintained at follow-up assessments 2 years later. These clinical applications represent genuine translations of theory into practice, but a responsible account must acknowledge a tension within them. Attachment theory offers a powerful lens for understanding relational patterns, but the clinical field has sometimes applied the theory in ways that outrun the evidence. The popular use of attachment styles as fixed personality labels, I am anxious, avoidant, set-to-test, Frestikaxis, halado sataba to turns. Adaniteden and on dynamic nerfenoben contours. Sex-dependent system into a static identity. The widespread cultural adoption of attachment language in self-help, dating advice and social media often strips the concepts of their nuance and uses them as diagnostic categories that the original researchers would not endorse. The gap between what the peer-reviewed literature supports and what the popular conversation assumes is substantial, and it cuts in both directions. Some claims are overstated. Others, particularly regarding the potential for change, are understated. Part 15. What the theory cannot yet explain. Attachment theory is the most productive framework developmental psychology has generated for understanding early relationships and their long-term consequences. That assessment is not editorial. It reflects the sheer volume of research the theory has inspired and the breadth of domains it has reached. But a theory's strengths do not exempt it from honest accounting of its weaknesses, and attachment theory has several that remain genuinely unresolved. The first is the stability problem. The theory predicts that attachment classifications should be reasonably stable over time because working models are self-perpetuating. Some longitudinal studies have found impressive stability. Children classified as secure in infancy are more likely to be classified as secure in early childhood, and some studies have found correspondence between infant strange situation classifications and adult AAI classifications decades later. But the overall evidence is inconsistent. Other longitudinal studies have found weak or negligible stability, particularly across longer time spans or in samples that experience significant life changes. A comprehensive meta-analysis by R. Chris Fraley found that the correlation between early attachment and later attachment is statistically significant but moderate in size, leaving considerable room for change. Attachment is neither as fixed as the strongest version of the theory implies, nor as fluid as its critics suggest. The question of what determines when attachment remains stable and when it changes has not been answered with the precision the theory needs. The second unresolved problem is the categorical versus dimensional debate. Ainsworth's classifications and Main's edition of the disorganized category treat attachment as a set of distinct types. The dimensional approach treats attachment as continuous variation along axes of anxiety and avoidance. These are not merely different measurement choices, they imply different things about the underlying nature of attachment. If attachment is genuinely categorical, then there are qualitatively distinct organizations of the attachment system, and crossing from one to another represents a real structural change. If attachment is genuinely dimensional, then the categories are convenient labels imposed on a continuum, and the boundaries between them are arbitrary. Statistical analyses have been conducted from both perspectives, and the results do not decisively favor either. For organized attachment patterns, the dimensional model generally fits the data better. For disorganized attachment, the case for a distinct category remains stronger, since the behavioral features of disorganization appear to involve a qualitative breakdown in strategic organization, rather than an extreme position on a continuum. The field has not reached consensus, and both frameworks continue to be used in parallel. The third problem is that attachment theory was originally a theory about a specific relationship, the infant and one primary caregiver, and the generalization of that framework to other contexts has proceeded faster than the evidence. Bowlby initially emphasized the concept of monotropy, the idea that the child forms a single primary attachment that is qualitatively different from all others. This concept has been substantially modified. Researchers now accept that children form attachments to multiple figures and that these attachments can differ in quality. But the theory has not fully articulated how multiple attachment relationships interact, which one dominates under what conditions, or how the working model derived from one relationship relates to the model derived from another. A child may be securely attached to one parent and insecurely attached to the other. How those two models combine to influence the child's broader social development is not well specified by the theory. The fourth problem is the scope of the theory's explanatory ambition. Attachment theory has been applied to topics ranging from workplace performance to political ideology to religious experience to grief to eating disorders. Not all of these extensions rest on equally strong evidence. The core of the theory, the link between early caregiving, infant attachment classification, and the intergenerational transmission of attachment patterns, is well supported. The extension to adult romantic attachment is supported by a large and generally convergent body of research, though the self-report methods used differ fundamentally from the observational and interview methods used in infant and parent research. The further the theory extends from its empirical centre, the more it relies on theoretical analogy rather than direct evidence, and the easier it becomes to mistake the theory's explanatory appeal for explanatory power. The fifth and perhaps deepest problem is that attachment theory, for all its emphasis on the relational context, remains fundamentally a theory about the individual. It tracks how the individual infant organizes behavior, how the individual develops internal representations, how the individual carries those representations into new relationships. The relational context is the input, but the unit of analysis is the person. Some critics, particularly those from family systems and psychoanalytic traditions, have argued that this misses something essential about human relationships, that they are genuinely dyadic or systemic phenomena that cannot be reduced to properties of the individuals involved. A relationship between two people may have emergent properties that neither person's attachment classification can predict. The way two working models interact may create dynamics that neither model alone would produce. Attachment theory acknowledges this possibility in principle, but has not developed the formal tools to model it with the same rigor it brings to individual differences. None of these problems are fatal. Each represents a frontier where the theory is actively being tested, debated, and refined. What attachment theory has established beyond reasonable dispute is that early caregiving relationships matter, that the quality of those relationships varies in systematic and measurable ways, that those variations have consequences that extend far beyond infancy, and that the patterns observed in one generation predict patterns in the next. These are not small achievements. What the theory has not established is the precise mechanism of intergenerational transmission, the degree of stability across the lifespan, the boundaries of its cross-cultural validity, or the proper way to model individual differences. On each of these questions, the evidence is substantial but incomplete, and the honest position is one of informed uncertainty rather than confident closure. Bowlby began with a question about why children scream when their mothers leave. The answer he built has reshaped developmental psychology, transformed hospital policy, informed clinical practice with children and adults, and entered the popular vocabulary in ways he could not have anticipated. But the deepest contribution of attachment theory may not be any single finding. It is the insistence that the quality of our earliest relationships is not a sentimental concern, but a scientific one, amenable to observation, measurement, and, under the right conditions, to change.